Hi guys. So I'm hoping that everyone had a good weekend. I'm hoping that we worked well or found the storyboard project something that was helpful in trying to get those plot elements put together and determined, right? So that narrative storytelling pattern, right? That begins with our exposition, we introduce the characters, and then the conflict comes in, and we have rising action until we get to a climax, falling action, and denouement. So I'm hoping that that went well. Um, and and if you finish that project and you'd like to take a picture of it and send it on to me, then go ahead and do that. What we're doing today now is we're going to move on to narrative voice. So I've put together a PowerPoint. There's a PowerPoint there for you to open, and then there's just all the notes from the PowerPoint I've put into a Word document so that you can read it as well. We're just going to go over that today. Tomorrow we're going to do a story, and you're going to work figuring out narrative voice. Okay, so we've got the basic parts of the story. Now we're getting into more nuanced details because you have to really read critically to understand this. We're in GCO7 here, right? We're reading critically. We're understanding what's going on, what's what, and how the story is working. How the story is working is reading critically, right? We're not just making connections. We're not just reading and understanding the story, but we're able to pick it apart and understand how it's working. So the question of narrator and narrative voice is all about who's telling the story, right? The story needs a storyteller. So it's on a page. You don't have somebody literally telling it to you a lot of times, although I'm going to read our next story to us tomorrow. Sometimes you might have a reader. But when you're reading a story, it's like there's this implied storyteller who's telling the story. So, as our notes say, it's not just the author, right? It's not just the author telling the story. There's kind of a voice there. There's an author. There's somebody that's some voice that the author's made up to tell the story from a very distinct perspective, and that person, that voice, is the narrator of the story. So there are several different kinds, um, but they mostly divide up into first person and third person. I'll talk about second person briefly here in a little bit, but first person, third person are the main kind. So our first person narrative is quite a simple um, way to tell a story because it's what we're used to. When we tell stories about ourselves and things that happen to us, I went here, I went there, here's what I did. That's first person. So a first person narrator is a character who's in the story telling you what happened in the story. Now, just because a story has a first-person narrator doesn't mean they are the main character. Often they are, but they don't always have to be. They're just a person who's in the story and telling you what they see and what's going on in the story. So somebody to think of is Ponyboy. Ponyboy um, in our story, The Outsiders, is a first-person narrator. Even in the movie, it starts as I stepped out into the bright light of after the dim movie theater, something like that. I don't have it exactly, but it's talking about me. Here's what happened to me. That is a first person narrator. Okay? So I'm the first person in the story. It's my story first, and then I tell what I see around. That's our first person narrative. I want to, I want to, so I'll just briefly touch on second person because I think people say, well, why does it go first and third and there's not a second? There is such thing as second. Second person is simply when I say you instead of I. Very few stories are told this way, but once in a while they are. Once in a while you see a story that says you wake up, it's a sunny day and the sun is shining through your window and the birds are chirping. You get out of bed and you go downstairs and notice that there no one else is around. Right? That's a second person, whereas a first person would say I woke up. I woke up, I looked around me, no one was there. It was a bright sunny day. I went down and I made myself some breakfast. And then, so what's a third person? Third person narrator is someone who's not in the story. They would not say I, they wouldn't say you for what happened. They talk in terms like Bob or Jane or she or they or he, right? That's how they talk. So they woke up, it was a bright sunny morning. They got out of bed and wandered down the stairs and noticed that no one else is around. That is third person. Okay? So we're familiar with that third person narrator because a lot of the stories we're told when we're children are third person. Fairy tales are usually told as third person stories, right? We talk about there were three little pigs, along came a wolf. Nobody in the story is telling the story. Third person can be complex though. So this is where we start to get more sophisticated and we see, okay, can we figure this out? So a third person omniscient narrator is so omniscient means all seeing. I can see everything that happens. Third person omniscient narrator sees everything and they can tell you what's happening. They can tell you what characters are thinking. They can tell you what's happening in different places. They can tell you what is happening in one place while something's happening in the other place. A good example of that is the narrator in Cinderella. It's very much a third-person narrator because it tells us, oh, the prince is looking for Cinderella. It tells us where Cinderella is hiding. It tells us what she's thinking and how she slipped away. And then it tells us where the prince is and what he's thinking as he tries to find her. We know everybody's thoughts. We know every movement that all of them are making. That narrator is omniscient, right? They are able to tell us everything. So Cinderella is a good example to think of. We also have third person limited. So this is a narrator that might seem a lot like the omniscient narrator, but they have some limitations on what they can see. So a lot of times a third person limited narrator is somebody who is really limited to the thoughts of one character or one place, right? So it's like they're third person. They're not in the story, but they don't tell you everything that's going on in everyone's head, or they don't tell you everything that's going on everywhere. On the Sidewalk Bleeding is a really good example of a third person limited narrator because it tells us what Andy's thinking, right? That narrator knows everything Andy's thinking. The narrator doesn't know what's happening in the heads of the other people that come into the alley. He only knows what they say. So what Andy can see, the narrator can see, but it's not Andy talking. He doesn't say, I'm laying in the sidewalk bleeding. Andy laid on the sidewalk bleeding. Right? So we're just getting in Andy's head. And Andy's wondering what's happening with Laura. And Andy's wondering, well, what's happening outside of the alleyway? Narrator doesn't know, or the narrator doesn't tell us. He's limited. The narrator is limited to what's happening in the alleyway and what's happening in Andy's head. And even after Andy dies, we're still in the alleyway. We get to see Laura come. We get to see the police officer come. We only get to see what they say, though. We don't get what's inside of their head. So that's third person limited. Okay. There's another type of third person narrator. I don't know if he's done a story that really works this way, but it's called third person objective. So that's not even limited. It's a type of third person limited narrator. It's just narrowing it down a little more. That's when you have somebody who's describing as though they're watching a play, right? So it's almost like it's a play. So they can tell you everything that happens in front of you as if you were watching the play. They're just describing. They don't tell you what is happening in anybody's head. They don't tell you what. Usually they don't even flash back, right? There's no flashbacks. There's nothing like that. It's just as if you were watching a play, right? You get to see people come in. You get to see them talk. They leave, right? Third person objective. We haven't really done a story that's a good example of that yet. So just imagine it that way. We're at a play, but we can't see and we can't hear, or somebody's at a play, and they're just describing the scene to us. Okay, so our last couple of things is character presentation. We figure out characters by the way the narrator describes them and what they tell us about them. So I want to think of two different types of character presentation. One way that a narrator reveals character and tells us what they are like or what's going on is through direct presentation. This is when the narrator or somebody in the story tells us about a character. Johnny had a bad temper. That's direct presentation. That's a description. Somebody's telling us. Now we know Johnny has a bad temper. Indirect presentation is when they show us something. They don't tell us. Direct presentation, I tell you, Johnny had a bad temper. Indirect presentation, I'm going to show you. And you're going to have to figure that out. So instead of saying Johnny had a bad temper, we have Billy bumps into Johnny by accident, and Johnny flew into a rage. Right? He gets mad. He throws his books. He yells at Billy, maybe threatens him. We know now Johnny had a bad temper, but nobody told us. It was shown to us. It's indirect. Okay, those are the things that we're going to be using this week. We're going to work on a story tomorrow, and kind of look at the types of narrator and types of character presentation. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about types of character too, because we'll go back to that a little bit. So all I want you to do now is you might want to take a few minutes to take those notes and go through the types of narrator and see if you can think of your own examples from things that you've seen for those types of narrator. Tomorrow we'll do it specifically with Stephen King's really cool story. We'll talk about King's story tomorrow. All right. Have a good day. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.